Tonight, I'm sharing 10 of the scariest stories from Road Night Drive. As you listen, ask yourself, do you think these stories are real? Strange, unexplainable, terrifying. Could something like this happen in your city? Let me know what you think and where you're from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you dare. I hate driving at night, but sometimes you don't have a choice. This particular night, I was stuck working late again, so I was already on edge. The highway was quiet. Too quiet, if I'm being honest. It was just me, the hum of my car's engine, and the long stretch of road ahead. You'd think that would make it peaceful, but something felt off. It wasn't until I passed a broken down car on the shoulder that the weirdness really started. A figure stood next to it, a man in a hooded jacket, waving at me to stop. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about helping someone, but the way he moved, it gave me chills. His arm was jerky, like he wasn't fully in control of it. I slowed down just enough to get a better look, but as soon as I saw his face, or what should have been his face, I hit the gas. There was nothing there. No eyes, no mouth. Just smooth skin where his face should have been. My heart shot into my throat as I sped past him. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was the darkness or a trick of the light, but deep down I knew better. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see him running after me, but the road behind me was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. About 10 minutes later, I saw headlights approaching in the opposite lane. It was the first car I'd seen in miles. I felt an odd sense of relief, like seeing another person meant I wasn't completely alone in the dark. But as the car got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't just any car, it was the same car I had passed earlier, the broken down one. How could it be moving? I had just seen it sitting on the shoulder with that thing standing next to it. But here it was, headlights beaming straight at me, coming fast. Too fast. I swerved into the shoulder to avoid a head-on collision, barely keeping control of my car as the other vehicle zoomed past. My tires kicked up gravel, and I almost skidded into the ditch. When I looked in my rearview mirror, there was nothing there. No car, no lights. Just the empty highway stretching behind me like it always had. I pulled over to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely keep my grip on the wheel. My first thought was to call someone, anyone, but I didn't have cell service. Typical. I cursed under my breath and stared out at the road, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. That's when I saw it again. The man, or whatever he was. He was standing about 50 feet behind my car, right in the middle of the road. He wasn't waving this time. He was just standing there perfectly still, with his head tilted slightly to the side, like he was studying me. My chest tightened, and I reached for the ignition. My car sputtered and died. No, I muttered, turning the key again and again, but the engine wouldn't start. When I looked up, he was closer, maybe 20 feet away now. I couldn't see his face. It was too dark, but I didn't need to. I could feel his eyes on me, boring into me, even though I was sure he didn't have any. In a panic, I locked the doors and grabbed the flashlight from my glove box. I didn't have a weapon, but maybe I could blind him long enough to figure something out. With trembling hands, I flicked on the light and aimed it out the window. He was gone. I scanned the area, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. No sign of him anywhere. I tried starting the car again, and this time, the engine roared to life. I didn't wait around to see if he'd come back. I floored it, the tires screeching as I tore down the highway. I kept expecting him to appear in my rearview mirror, but he didn't. Eventually, the uneasy feeling started to fade, and I let out a shaky breath. Maybe it was over. Maybe he was just some hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. Then I glanced at the passenger seat. There was a smudge on the window, like someone had pressed their face against the glass from the outside. And written in the condensation were 2 words: "See you." I didn't stop driving until I reached the city limits. To this day, I don't take that highway at night. And every now and then, when I'm alone in the car, I check the passenger seat, just in case. It was raining that night. The kind of rain that makes it hard to see more than a few feet in front of your car. I had just wrapped up a long shift and was driving home on a winding back road I usually avoided at night. But with the highway closed for construction, I didn't have much of a choice. The storm didn't help either. The wipers struggled to keep up, and the constant drumming of rain on the roof made everything feel claustrophobic. I was halfway through the stretch of woods when I saw him, just standing there on the side of the road. A man, soaking wet, with his thumb out. He wasn't wearing a jacket, just a soaked white t-shirt and jeans. My first instinct was to keep driving, but something about him made me slow down. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like he knew I was going to stop. I rolled down the passenger window just a crack. "You need a ride?" He nodded, water dripping from his hair. "Yeah. My car broke down a few miles back." His voice was calm, almost too calm, considering the storm. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors. He climbed in without saying a word, shaking off some of the rain before settling into the seat. I turned the heat up, more to break the awkward silence than anything else. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just down the road," he replied, staring straight ahead. "I'll let you know where to drop me off." The way he said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something about him felt wrong. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was going through the motions of being human but didn't quite know how. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just tired, or scared. For the first few minutes we didn't talk. The only sounds were the rain and the tires, splashing through puddles. I stole a glance at him, trying not to be obvious. He didn't look dangerous, mid-30s maybe, with dark eyes and a face that was hard to read. But there was something about the way he sat, perfectly still, that made my skin crawl. "You from around here?" I asked, hoping to break the tension. He turned to look at me, and I instantly regretted asking. "No," he said, a faint smile creeping across his face. "But I know this road." That didn't make sense. If he wasn't from around here, how would he know the road? Before I could ask, he added, "A lot of people disappear here." My grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, wiping a foggy patch off the window. "It's dangerous," he said finally. "People drive through and they're never seen again." I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, good thing I'm just passing through." He didn't laugh. He just turned to me with that same unsettling smile. "Maybe you won't be." My stomach twisted. I told myself he was just messing with me. But the way he said it, it felt more like a warning, or a promise. We drove in silence after that. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the way he occasionally glanced at me, out of the corner of his eye. The rain started to let up, and I finally saw a gas station up ahead. The lights were dim, but it was open. I cleared my throat. "I'll drop you off here." He didn't argue, just nodded, and reached for the door handle. But before he got out, he turned to me one last time. "Drive safe," he said, his voice softer now. "You'll want to keep going straight. Don't turn off the main road, no matter what." With that, he stepped out into the rain and disappeared into the shadows of the gas station. I didn't wait around to see where he went. Something about the way he'd said those last words had me on edge. I drove off, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. But as I rounded the next curve, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A car was sitting on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking. It looked familiar. Too familiar. Slowing down, I realized why. It was the car the hitchhiker had described. The hood was popped, and the driver's seat was empty. My heart pounded as I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there. But the road behind me was empty. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. But for the rest of the drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake by letting him go. Maybe he was warning me, or maybe he was leading me into something worse. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window. But even now, I can't help but wonder if he was telling the truth about this road, or if he's still out there, waiting for his next. It was a Friday night, and I was heading home from a late dinner with a couple of friends. The highway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by scattered streetlights. It was one of those nights where the fog hugged the road, like it had something to hide. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, but the forecast hadn't mentioned rain. I shrugged it off and kept driving. The thing about driving late at night is that your mind starts playing tricks on you. At first, that's what I thought was happening. I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. Close. Way too close. I hate when people tailgate, so I tapped the brakes lightly. A universal signal for back off. But the car didn't budge. It just stayed there, maybe 10 feet behind me, its headlights glaring into my rearview mirror. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us. For a moment it worked. The car fell back, and I let out a sigh of relief. But then, out of nowhere, it was right on me again. This time, it was even closer. So close, I could make out the shape of the driver's silhouette. They weren't just tailgating me. They were toying with me. "All right, buddy. What's your problem?" I muttered under my breath, gripping the wheel tighter. I slowed down, hoping they'd pass me. But they didn't. Instead, they matched my speed perfectly. My frustration quickly turned to unease. Something wasn't right. I flicked on my turn signal and took the next exit, hoping to lose them. The off-ramp was dark, with only a single streetlight at the intersection ahead. I glanced in the mirror. The car was gone. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. Must have been some idiot messing around, I told myself. But the moment I turned back onto the main road, there they were, those same blinding headlights, sitting at the edge of my vision. My heart raced as I realized they'd followed me, and they were playing games. This time, I didn't bother slowing down. I floored it, the engine roaring as I sped down the empty road. The car didn't chase me at first. It just lingered, like it was waiting for the perfect moment. And then, without warning, it shot forward. It wasn't just tailgating now. It was trying to push me off the road. I swerved, barely keeping control as my tires screeched against the pavement. I don't know why I didn't call for help. Maybe it was panic, or maybe I thought no one would believe me. Instead, I just drove faster, weaving in and out of lanes like a madman. The car stayed with me the whole time, its headlights glaring into my rearview mirror, like two burning eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the car vanished. 1 second, it was there, its high beams flooding my car with light. The next, the road behind me was empty. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. Cars don't just disappear. I slowed down, my hands trembling on the wheel, and scanned the road. There was no sign of the car, no sound of an engine. Nothing. I should have been relieved, but I wasn't. My gut told me it wasn't over. I kept driving, my eyes darting between the road and my mirrors. Every shadow seemed to move. Every flicker of light felt like a warning. And then I saw it. Up ahead, on the side of the road, was the car. It was parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking. I slowed down, torn between stopping and speeding past. The hood was up and the driver's door was open, but there was no one around. Just the car, sitting there like a trap. Against my better judgment, I pulled over a few feet away. I don't know why. I guess I wanted answers. I grabbed my phone and stepped out, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. The car looked old up close, the kind of beat-up sedan you'd see in a junkyard. The license plate was rusted, and the windows were so dark I couldn't see inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I stepped closer, my phone's flashlight cutting through the fog. That's when I saw it. The driver's seat was empty, but there was something on the dashboard. A photograph. I leaned in, squinting to make it out, and my blood turned to ice. It was a picture of me, sitting in my car, taken from behind, like someone had been following me the entire time. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I heard it, the sound of an engine revving behind me. I spun around, but it was too late. The headlights blinded me as the car roared to life, speeding straight at me. I jumped out of the way, hitting the ground hard. When I looked up, the car was gone. I don't know how I got home that night. The whole drive is a blur. But ever since then, I can't drive at night without checking my mirrors every few seconds. I keep expecting to see those headlights again. Or worse, that picture of me waiting on my dashboard. It was a little after midnight when I decided to take the back roads home. I wasn't in the mood for traffic lights or crowded highways. And besides, the shortcut through the woods would save me 20 minutes. The drive started off uneventful. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires on the cracked asphalt were almost soothing. But as I got deeper into the forest, the air seemed to change. It felt heavier, colder, like the trees were pressing in around me. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. A woman, maybe in her late 20s, wearing a white dress that looked like it had been dragged through the mud. Her hair was wild, tangled, and her bare feet were caked in dirt. She wasn't moving, just standing there with her head tilted slightly to the side, like she was waiting for me. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching, as the car skidded to a stop, just a few feet away from her. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I rolled down the window a crack, not sure if I should get out or just drive around her. "Are you okay?" I called out. She didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me with these wide, vacant eyes. There was something off about her face. It wasn't just the dirt or the hollow look in her eyes. It was her expression, or the lack of one. Like she wasn't entirely human. I glanced at my phone, thinking about calling for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. Out here in the middle of nowhere, my phone might as well have been a brick. "Miss, do you need help?" I asked again, louder this time. Still nothing. She just tilted her head the other way, her eyes never leaving mine. A chill ran down my spine. Something about her felt wrong. Dangerous. I thought about getting out of the car, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to. Instead, I decided to drive around her. Maybe she was in shock or something, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I shifted into reverse, keeping my eyes on her the whole time. She didn't move. Not an inch. Once I was far enough back, I steered around her, giving her plenty of space. As I passed, I glanced out the window, trying to get a better look. That's when she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a twisted, unnatural grin that stretched too wide, showing teeth that were too sharp. My blood ran cold, and I hit the gas, not caring if I ran off the road. I just wanted to get as far away from her as possible. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The road seemed longer than I remembered, like it was stretching out in front of me. Every shadow looked like it was moving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I checked the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see her standing in the middle of the road again, but it was always empty. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the lights of a gas station up ahead. I pulled in, my tires kicking up gravel as I came to a stop. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath and trying to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. Maybe it was just some crazy woman, or maybe I was just tired. Either way, I wasn't about to go back and check. I decided to grab a coffee before heading the rest of the way home. As I got out of the car, I glanced at the back seat out of habit, and froze. There was a muddy handprint on the inside of the rear passenger window. My heart sank as I slowly turned around, scanning the parking lot. It was empty. Just me and the dull hum of the gas station's fluorescent lights. I leaned back into the car and grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, but the screen was still stuck on no service. That's when I saw her reflection in the rearview mirror. She was sitting in the back seat, that same twisted smile on her face. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My body wouldn't move. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at her reflection, but when I finally turned around, the back seat was empty. I didn't go home that night. I drove straight to the next town and checked into a motel, where I spent the rest of the night staring at the door, waiting for it to open. I still take the highway now, no matter how much traffic there is, and every time I drive past the turnoff for those back roads, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, just in case. It was supposed to be a quick drive, just a simple errand to pick up some groceries from the 24-hour store a couple of towns over. The main roads were closed for maintenance, so I had no choice but to take the winding back roads that snaked through the hills. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd driven this route before, and it always seemed peaceful at night. But that night wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. The fog rolled in, thicker than I'd ever seen, swallowing the road and the trees on either side. My headlights barely cut through it, illuminating only a few feet in front of me. The world felt smaller, like I was the only person left in existence. The silence was deafening, broken only by the low hum of my engine. I told myself it was just fog, nothing to be scared of. I turned up the radio to drown out my unease, but the static made it worse. Every few seconds, it would cut out completely, replaced by silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I switched it off. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow shifting in the fog. But as I got closer, it became clear. There was someone, or something, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop, just feet away from the figure. My heart was pounding, and my hands gripped the wheel so tightly, they ached. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, tall and thin, wrapped in what looked like a dark cloak or coat. Its face was obscured by the fog, but I could feel its eyes on me, like a weight pressing against my chest. I honked the horn, hoping it would move. It didn't. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, like it was curious or amused. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Something about the way it moved wasn't human. "Hey!" I shouted, rolling down my window just enough for my voice to carry. "Get out of the road!" No response. It just kept standing there, watching me. Or maybe waiting. I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I shifted into reverse, but the moment I started backing up, the figure took a step forward. My breath caught in my throat as it slowly moved closer, one deliberate step at a time. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being dragged on invisible strings. Panic set in. I slammed the car into drive and swerved around it, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped past. For a moment, I thought I was safe. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and silent. But then I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was still there. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, exactly where it had been, except now it was facing my car. I could see it more clearly now. Tall and impossibly thin, its arms hanging at odd angles. Its face was still hidden, but I felt its gaze burning into me. I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. The fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around the car like a cocoon. Every so often, I would glance in the mirror, half expecting to see the figure closer than before. But the road behind me was empty. I started to convince myself it was over. Maybe it was just some weirdo messing with me, or maybe my mind was playing tricks. But then, my headlights caught something up ahead, and my stomach dropped. It was the figure, standing in the middle of the road again. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop, just inches away from it. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe. How was it possible? I'd left it behind miles ago. This time, it moved. Slowly, it raised one arm and pointed directly at me. I didn't wait to see what it wanted. I swerved around it again, my tires screeching as I sped down the road. My hands were shaking and I could barely keep the wheel steady. The fog seemed to close in even tighter, and every shadow felt like it was reaching for me. Finally, I saw the lights of a small diner up ahead. I pulled into the lot, my tires kicking up gravel as I came to a stop. I stumbled out of the car, my legs barely able to hold me up. I rushed inside, desperate for the comfort of other people. The waitress behind the counter gave me a strange look as I collapsed onto a stool, trying to catch my breath. "You okay, hun?" she asked, pouring me a cup of coffee. I nodded, though I didn't feel okay. Just saw something on the road. Someone. She frowned, glancing out the window at the foggy night. "You're not the first to say that," she muttered. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "A lot of people have seen something out there. Always at night, always in the fog. And none of them ever come back the same. I didn't sleep that night. And to this day, I refuse to drive when the fog rolls in." It was a little after 2 a.m., and I had been driving for hours. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, with nothing but the occasional reflective sign breaking up the monotony. My phone had died about an hour ago, leaving me with no GPS, and I hadn't seen another car in miles. I was running on fumes, both in my gas tank and in my body. Relief hit me when I saw a glowing sign ahead. Joe's Gas and Diner, open 24/7. It looked old and weathered, but it was a welcome sight. I turned into the gravel lot, which crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the single, rusty gas pump. The place felt like it had been frozen in time, like something out of the 1950s. The diner lights flickered faintly, but there was no one inside. The windows were smeared with grime, and the neon sign buzzed faintly, its hum mixing with a distant chirping of crickets. I stepped out of the car, the chill of the night air biting at my skin. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. The pump was old, the kind where you had to flip a lever to get it started. I swiped my card, but nothing happened. Great. Cash only. I sighed and glanced toward the diner. The door was slightly ajar, the dim interior visible through the glass. A flickering fluorescent light illuminated a small counter and a few booths. I decided to head inside. As I pushed open the door, a bell jingled overhead, the sound echoing unnaturally in the empty space. "Anyone here?" I asked, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. No one responded. The diner smelled faintly of grease and something metallic, like blood. The tables were clean, but the napkin holders and ketchup bottles looked ancient, their metal rusted and flaking. I walked to the counter where a small bell sat next to a cash register. I rang it once, The sharp ding echoed into the back room. I waited. Nothing. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a coffee cup sitting on the counter, steam still rising from it. Someone had been here recently. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. The sound of my voice seemed to disappear into the walls, swallowed up by the eerie stillness. My gut told me to leave, but I needed gas. I peered into the kitchen through the service window. Pots and pans hung on the walls, and a faint sizzling sound came from the stovetop. Then I saw it. A shadow moved, just barely visible, in the dim light of the kitchen. It darted out of sight the moment I noticed it, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. Someone, or something, was back there. "Hey, I just need some gas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll pay and be on my way." No response. Just the faint sound of sizzling, like something was cooking. I backed away from the counter, my pulse quickening. My eyes darted to the coffee cup again. The steam was gone. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, when I heard a loud thud from the back room. It sounded like something heavy falling to the floor. "Hello?" I called out one last time, though my voice was shaking now. I didn't really want an answer anymore. I just wanted to leave. As I turned to bolt, the kitchen door creaked open. I froze. A figure stepped out, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, its movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. "Leaving already?" the figure said, its voice low and raspy. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. "I just need gas," I stammered. "That's all." The figure stepped closer, its footsteps eerily silent on the tiled floor. "No one ever just needs gas," it said, that same chilling tone in its voice. Without thinking, I bolted for the door, shoving it open so hard the bell snapped off. I sprinted to my car, fumbling for the keys in my pocket. As I glanced back, I saw the figure standing in the doorway, its outline framed by the dim light inside. It didn't chase me. It just stood there watching. I managed to get the engine started and tore out of the lot, gravel spraying behind me. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely keep the wheel steady. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the diner and the figure were gone. The lot was empty, like it had never been there. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. When I pulled into a busy gas station, I tried to tell the attendant what had happened, but they just gave me a strange look. "There's no diner out there," they said. "Hasn't been for years, burned down in the 70s. People say it's haunted, but I don't know if I believe all that." I didn't respond. I didn't have the energy to argue. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching me leave. It was past midnight when I found myself driving down a stretch of a rural highway I'd never taken before. My GPS had rerouted me due to a major accident on the main road, and I was too tired to argue. The highway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every little noise your car makes. My headlights carved a path through the pitch-black night, illuminating the occasional road sign or twisted tree. I hadn't seen another car for miles when I first noticed him. A man running along the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me. No one would be out running at this hour, especially not on a highway. But as I got closer, it became clear that it wasn't just a shadow or my imagination. He was barefoot, wearing a tattered shirt and shorts that were soaked through, as though he'd been running for hours. His movements were erratic, his arms flailing slightly as he ran, like he was on the verge of collapse. Something about the way he moved set my nerves on edge. It was desperate and unnatural. I slowed down as I approached, my instincts at war with my curiosity. Maybe he's in trouble, I thought. Maybe he needs help. I rolled down my window just a crack, careful not to stop the car completely. "Hey, you okay?" I called out. He didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. He just kept running, his head jerking from side to side, like he was looking for something, or running from something. My skin prickled with unease. I drove past him, glancing in the rearview mirror as he disappeared into the darkness behind me. A part of me felt guilty for not stopping, but something about him felt wrong. I couldn't shake the image of his face, or lack of one. As I had passed him, I realized I hadn't seen any features, just pale, blank skin where his face should have been. My chest tightened as I sped up, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. But a few miles down the road, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was him, the same runner. He was ahead of me now, moving in that same frantic, jerky way. There was no way he could have gotten there so fast. I hadn't passed any side roads or shortcuts. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. This time, I didn't slow down. I pressed the gas pedal, my heart pounding as I prepared to swerve around him. As I passed, I couldn't help but glance out the window. He turned his head to look at me, and I nearly screamed. His face wasn't blank anymore. It was distorted, like a warped reflection in a funhouse mirror. His mouth stretched impossibly wide in a twisted grin, and his eyes, if you could call them that, were black pits that seemed to pull the light out of the air. I sped past him, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, but I could feel him behind me. That sense of being watched was so overwhelming, it made my skin crawl. And then, I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't faint or distant. They were loud, rhythmic, and impossibly fast, like he was sprinting just behind my car. My speedometer climbed, 60, 70, 80. But the footsteps didn't fade. They kept pace with me, echoing in the stillness of the night. My headlights caught a sign for a rest stop up ahead, and I made a split-second decision. I swerved into the exit, my tires screeching as I pulled into the empty lot. I threw the car into park, my breathing ragged as I scanned the darkness around me. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe I'd lost him. But then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from the back of the car. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, I turned around, my eyes darting to the rear window. He was there, crouched on the trunk, his twisted face grinning at me through the glass. I screamed and slammed on the gas, the car lurching forward as I sped back onto the highway. When I finally worked up the courage to check the mirror, he was gone. The only thing left was a faint smear of dirt on the glass where his hand had been. I didn't stop driving until I reached the city limits, and even then, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him running after me. I've avoided that stretch of highway ever since. But sometimes, late at night, when the roads are quiet and the world feels too still, I think I can hear it, the sound of footsteps, keeping pace with me in the dark. I was heading back home after a weekend trip to visit an old friend. The GPS on my phone said it would take 3 hours, but as the minutes ticked by, I realized I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. The familiar scenery had vanished, replaced by narrow, winding roads, surrounded by dense woods. My GPS was glitching, constantly recalculating and pointing me in circles. It was frustrating, but I figured I'd eventually find my way back to the main highway. The deeper I went, the stranger it got. The road signs were old, some completely faded, and the trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows in my headlights. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the darkness beyond the trees. The first real sign that something was wrong came when I spotted the house. It appeared out of nowhere, sitting just off the side of the road. A decrepit 2-story farmhouse with broken windows and a sagging roof. The porch light was on, casting a sickly yellow glow over the front yard, which was overgrown with weeds and littered with rusted tools. I slowed down as I passed, my curiosity getting the better of me. The place looked abandoned, but the light was on. That didn't make sense. Who would live out here in the middle of nowhere? As I stared, something moved in one of the upstairs windows. My heart skipped a beat. It was quick, just a shadow, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I hit the gas, eager to put distance between myself and that house. But the road didn't let me go so easily. A few miles later, I saw another house. It was the same house. My foot instinctively slammed on the brakes, and I came to a screeching stop in the middle of the road. My eyes darted to the yard, to the porch light, to the upstairs window. It was identical. Every broken board, every weed, every flicker of that sickly yellow light. Even the shadow in the window was there, moving just as it had before. I told myself it wasn't possible. I hadn't turned around. There were no forks or side roads. There was no way I could have ended up back at the same house. And yet, there it was, staring at me like it was waiting for me to come inside. I floored it. The tires screeched as I tore down the road, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't care about the speed limit or the twists and turns. I just wanted to get away. But as the minutes stretched on, I realized the road wasn't changing. It just kept going, endless and unbroken, with no signs, no intersections, no other cars. And then I saw it again. The house. This time I didn't stop. I sped past it, refusing to look too closely, but I could feel it pulling at me, demanding my attention. The porch light flickered, and I caught a glimpse of something in the yard. A figure standing just beyond the weeds. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its head tilted toward me as I passed. "Keep going," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "Don't stop. Don't look." But the road was relentless. No matter how far or how fast I drove, the house kept reappearing. It didn't make sense. I checked the clock on the dashboard, and my stomach sank. It wasn't moving. It had been 1:13 a.m. for what felt like hours. Panic set in. I couldn't stay on this road forever. My gas gauge was dropping, and I was starting to feel lightheaded. I considered turning around, but something deep in my gut told me that was a bad idea. Then, up ahead, I saw something new. A figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, my heart hammering in my chest. It was the same figure I'd seen in the yard. Tall, thin, and unnatural. Its limbs were too long, and its head hung at an unnatural angle, as though its neck couldn't quite support the weight. I stopped the car, too terrified to move forward. The figure didn't approach, didn't wave, didn't move. It just stood there, blocking the road, its shadow stretching unnaturally long in my headlights. "Go around it," I muttered, my voice shaking. I tried to steer to the side, but the figure moved with me, always staying directly in front of the car. I don't know what came over me, but something inside snapped. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires screeching as I sped backward. I didn't care where I ended up, as long as it wasn't here. The figure didn't chase me. It just watched, its head tilting further as I disappeared down the road. Eventually, I found myself back on a normal highway. I don't know how I got there, and I didn't care. All I know is that when I checked the clock again, it was 1:14 a.m. I never told anyone about that night, but sometimes when I'm driving alone, I see it. The house, always in the distance, always waiting. It started as a typical late-night drive home. The sky was ink black, dotted with faint stars, and the air was still. I'd stayed late at work finishing a project, and the empty roads were almost calming after such a long day. It was just me, my car, and the steady rhythm of the wheels on the pavement. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Someone else was heading in the same direction. It wasn't unusual. But as the minutes passed, the car didn't fall back or try to pass me. It stayed behind me, matching my speed perfectly. I shifted in my seat, a little uncomfortable now. Maybe they didn't want to drive alone, or maybe they were waiting for a good spot to overtake me. Either way, it was starting to get on my nerves. I slowed down, hoping they'd take the hint and pass, but they didn't. They just slowed down with me. "All right," I muttered under my breath, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. I decided to speed up, see if I could lose them. My car hummed as I pushed the accelerator, the road blurring slightly as I picked up speed. But when I glanced in the mirror, the headlights were still there, as bright and steady as ever. My stomach began to churn with unease. This wasn't normal. I switched lanes, taking a sharp turn onto a smaller road, but the car followed. No hesitation. Every turn I made, every attempt to shake them, they mirrored perfectly. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably just a coincidence. Maybe they lived in the same direction. But as I took another random turn onto a narrow, unlit road that I knew led to nowhere, I realized the truth. They weren't just following me. They were chasing me. I pressed harder on the gas, my car roaring as I sped down the empty road. The headlights grew brighter, closer, until it felt like they were right on top of me. My palms were slick with sweat, and my breaths came fast and shallow. I decided to test them. Up ahead was an old rest area, a gravel lot surrounded by tall trees. I swerved into it, my tires kicking up dust and rocks, and slammed on the brakes. I turned off my lights and killed the engine, sinking low in my seat, heart pounding so loudly it felt like it echoed in the small car. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the other car pulled into the lot. Its headlights were blinding, casting long, eerie shadows across the gravel. The car came to a stop about 20 feet away. But no one got out. The driver just sat there, the engine rumbling softly, the lights glaring into my car-like eyes. "Who the hell are you?" I whispered, too scared to move. My phone was in the passenger seat, but my hands were trembling too much to reach for it. I couldn't call for help, not without alerting them that I was still here. The car sat there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, the lights went out. Total darkness. I squinted, trying to see the car, but it was like it had vanished into thin air. The engine noise stopped, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they had turned off the car too. I waited, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own panicked breathing. Footsteps. They were faint at first, crunching softly on the gravel, but they grew louder, closer. Someone was walking toward my car. I fumbled for the ignition, my fingers slipping on the keys as the footsteps stopped. I glanced out the driver's side window, and my blood turned to ice. A face was pressed against the glass, pale and distorted, with hollow black eyes that seemed to swallow the darkness around them. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stared, its breath fogging up the window in slow, deliberate puffs. I screamed, shoving the keys into the ignition and twisting hard. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, my tires spinning wildly as I tore out of the lot. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The drive home was a blur. Every shadow on the road felt alive. Every sound made my heart jump. When I finally pulled into my driveway and locked every door and window, I sat in the dark for hours, shaking and staring at my phone. The police didn't take me seriously when I called them the next morning. Maybe it was a prank, they said. Kids messing around. But it wasn't a prank. I know what I saw. Now, whenever I drive at night, I keep checking my mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights again. And sometimes I do. It was late, one of those nights where you can't remember why you stayed out so long, but you're just too exhausted to care. The road home was empty, a straight shot through quiet suburbs and into the rural outskirts where my house stood alone. It wasn't a long drive, maybe 20 minutes, but that night, it felt like forever. I was halfway home when I noticed it. The feeling you get when you're not alone. My stomach tightened as the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at the rearview mirror instinctively. Nothing. Just the empty back seat, dimly illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard lights. I shook my head and laughed nervously to myself. "You're just tired," I muttered, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "Stop being paranoid." I turned on the radio, hoping the music would distract me, but the static was unbearable. Every station was a mess of hissing and distorted sounds, so I turned it off. The silence felt worse. It pressed in on me, thick and suffocating, amplifying the sound of my own breathing. That's when I saw it. In the mirror, just for a split second. A figure. A woman, sitting in the back seat. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the darkness. And her eyes were wrong. They were wide, unblinking, and locked on me. I whipped my head around so fast I nearly swerved off the road. The back seat was empty. My heart was pounding, and my throat felt dry. "You're seeing things," I told myself, forcing a shaky laugh. "You need sleep." But deep down, I didn't believe it. Something wasn't right. I kept driving, but I couldn't stop checking the mirror. Every few seconds, my eyes would dart up, expecting to see her again. I even turned on the interior light, to prove to myself that the back seat was empty. It was, and yet, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind wouldn't let it go. Who was she? What did I see? Was it real, or just some trick of the light? My thoughts spiraled as I drove deeper into the night. The next time I glanced at the mirror, she was there again. This time, she didn't disappear. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her head tilted slightly to one side. Her long dark hair framed her face, but it wasn't enough to hide her hollow, lifeless eyes. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She didn't move. She just stared at me through the mirror, her lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, cruel, like she was amused by my fear. I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. I twisted around in my seat, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The back seat was empty again. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The road around me was silent, the darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. I thought about getting out, about checking the car, but something in my gut screamed at me not to. Instead, I started driving again, faster this time. I didn't care about the speed limit or the bends in the road. I just wanted to get home. But no matter how fast I went, the feeling wouldn't go away. She was still there, just out of sight, lingering in the corners of my vision. I pulled into my driveway like a bat out of hell, slamming the car into park and grabbing my bag as I jumped out. I didn't even bother locking the car. I just ran to the front door, fumbling with my keys before finally shoving it open and slamming it behind me. I turned on every light in the house, my chest heaving as I tried to calm down. "You imagined it," I whispered to myself. "You're just tired. That's all." But when I turned toward the window, I froze. She was standing in the driveway, her head tilted just like before, her unblinking eyes fixed on me. She didn't move, didn't even flinch, but I could feel her smile growing wider. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear. But when I finally worked up the courage to look again, she was gone. It's been weeks since that night, and I haven't driven alone after dark since. But sometimes when I walk past my car, I catch a glimpse of something in the back seat, a pale face with hollow eyes, watching me.